din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. самых окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как невесту родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
baraban, i nas nie zagnieje błysk krzyczy, pod barabany rozkaz. Marsz левой 2, 3, марш левой 2, 3, встань левый, товарищ нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как все мы люди, то должны мы, извините, что-то есть. Хотят накормить нас пустой болтовней, шепча спасибо за честь. Марш левый 2, 3, марш левый 2, 3, встань левый, товарищ нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как ты рабочий, то не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу добудем твою своей рабочей рукой. Марш левый 2, 3, марш левый 2, 3, встань ряды, товарищ нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Modern Land in the Cities. Rein ein in der Arbeitereinheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Rein ein in der Arbeitereinheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Sretna pod słońcem, rasti u jaslama wiecin, rasti i cvjetaj zemljo radnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije холостяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the afternoon of the 22nd of October 2025, and here we are with the latest live stream entitled Trump-Putin Summit Cancelled. Probably should have added a question mark after that one. Certainly seems to be on the cancel side at the moment. We will come to that in just a few minutes. But first of all, we are going to have to do the usual housekeeping. So we are currently live on X, YouTube, Rumble, Twitch, and Substack now in the wonderful world of streaming on Substack. So be sure to like and share these streams, no matter which platform that you're watching on. And also check out the other platforms that this show is live on, because, of course, you never know when Google's going to pull the plug and this whole thing is going to disappear in a puff of censorship. So be sure to check out the Rumble, Twitch, X, and Substack pages for further details of upcoming streams. And be sure to like and share this one across all your different networks. So we are getting in to a few issues today. So we're going to be looking at the latest toing and froing over the potential meeting between Trump and Putin that then isn't a potential meeting. We're going to be looking at what the reasons for this. We're going to be looking at the latest bluff from the Starmer administration in the form of their latest bullshitting over deploying troops to Ukraine, and why even former British senior officers, actually the most senior retired officer out there, which is Field Marshal Richards, in a recent interview with The Independent, proclaimed that Ukraine can't win against Russia and neither could Britain. So there you go. We're also going to be looking at the return of show favourite St. Bernard of Burlington, who has degraded himself yet again, though probably not in a way that he thought, on the Daily Show, which means that this video, when we play that clip, is definitely going to get copyright struck to death. Now, after that, we're going to have a discussion on the back end of this particular program on the question of base versus superstructure, which is always the way that idiotic college professors introduce the concept of the dialectical materialism, and what the real nature of the Marxist analysis is. What is it in terms of the difference between how this is presented by the liberals, who always claim that we as Marxists are narrow economic determinists, and what's the reality in terms of what Marx and Engels actually wrote, and how Lenin, Stalin, Mao actually conducted their political movements. So I'm going to be coming to that later on, and going to be considering what the actual view of Engels was, with a quote from Anti-Düring, his seminal exposition of the Marxist method, shall we say. And I would recommend anybody read that. You don't have to read it all today. It might be a bit too long to read before 2 o'clock this afternoon. But it is all relevant in terms of if you can understand properly the way that that the dialectical materialist method actually works, and how you can use it to analyze both history and current events, you will understand the way that things play out a lot better than anybody with all manner of fancy letters after their names who has been to what in British terms would be the big universities such as Oxford or Cambridge, or the red brick universities. Or if you're American, if you're somebody with an Ivy League degree, if you have a proper understanding of dialectical materialism, you will actually be able to interpret these events that go on around the world, which are presented by the bourgeoisie to be as baffling as possible. You will be able to interpret this in the proper way, and you don't need a series of very expensive degrees, and you don't need to waste time to university to be able to grasp this. It is something that any worker can pick up and use to inform his or her understanding of the world. So we will now get into the meat of the issue, and we'll also, of course, be taking questions as we the final section of the program. We're going to be 2 brief intermissions today. Going to take a brief intermission after we've done the news section, and then going to get into the political discussion section. After that, we'll come back and do questions. So if you've got questions, be sure to put them in the chat, and I will work through it during the second intermission and make sure we get all those noted down. Some of them I'll be able to answer today. Some of them will have to go into the next Q&A, and I'm looking to schedule that probably for the weekend, but I will keep you updated. So let's then jump into this. Now, we're starting with the political story with regard to the, shall we say, delicate balance of idiocy between Trump and Zelensky, and the so-called negotiations that have gone on between the American side and the Russians. Now, all of this is informed by what is happening on the battlefield. And what's been happening on the battlefield in terms of the last few weeks has been almost uniformly bad for the NATO side. And what I mean by that is that the Russians have actually been doing some serious work on knocking out the. Now they've hit the Ukrainian energy before, it must be said. They did it in late 2022, again in 2023 to a certain extent. They went after they didn't hit the power stations directly, but they hit the transformers and like the relay stations that are the sections of the power network that send electricity across Ukraine from the power stations. This time, they're going after the power system, it would seem, in a more serious way. And this means that even in the big cities like Kiev, which previously, other than like pinpoint missile strikes and drone strikes in Kiev and places like Lvov, you could have gone to Lvov if you were some, shall we say, high-profile politician from a Western country. You could have gone there, and according to eyewitness reports, if you went to the right section of the city, i.e., the government part, perhaps somewhere some still live, then you would not really have known that there was a war on. There was an air of unreality, even to a certain extent in Kiev for a while. You see the pictures of how the wealthy continue to party in Kiev, and you can see why people would come away with the impression that it was a surreal atmosphere there. Well, now, according to the latest reports from Ukraine, the Western bourgeois press of now, like New York Times, Guardian, etc., have all been jumping on, saying, "Oh my God, the terrible Putin! He killed 3 people overnight." Meanwhile, the Israelis kill, even in a ceasefire period, 3 people inside about 3 minutes. So, lessons there to be learned if you want to understand them. So, the Russians have been knocking the lights out in Kiev, major urban centers. They've been severely stretching the energy grid in a way that they haven't done before. At the same time, as we covered recently in our last discussion of the Ukraine war, the way in which the Russians are going after the Ukrainian forces on the front is, if has not necessarily intensified, but it's reaching a point where the Ukrainians are struggling to keep up with the holes that are being picked in their defenses, particularly around Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. There is, of course, the talk about the Russians back into going onto Kherson city as well, which they, of course, famously withdrew from back in 2022 as part of the generalized tightening of their front line. Now, the effect of all of this is that there's clearly an awful lot of pressure being piled on the NATO side, and this triggers, of course, a series of new flurry of activity from the U.S. administration, and this is why Putin threatened with the provision of the Tomahawk to Ukraine, which, by the way, if it is possible for the Americans to do it, that is, if it's possible for them to get the launchers into Ukraine, if it's possible that they can have the sufficiently trained crews to man launchers, then I think that the Tomahawk missile will end up making an appearance in Ukraine. That is just the way that these things are going, and it will be treated like other Wunderwaffens that have gone in there. The Russians will, if countermeasures, then they will develop, or if they don't have them, they will develop them very quickly. Now, the dire state of the battlefield for the NATO side is the reason why Trump had the summit with Zelensky. It's the reason why the American side wanted some kind of meeting between Trump and Putin. Now, the question that has to be asked is, well, why? Now, here we will turn to our old friends at the New York. People may ask, with a degree of legitimacy, why read stuff? To read stuff like New York Times, Guardian, Telegraph, Financial Times, the usual suspects, we say, of the bourgeois press. It's important to read them because what you have to realize is that this is enemy media. This is the bourgeois press expresses two things: one, what they want you to believe, but two, what the bourgeoisie wants to read itself. And so you have to realize that stuff like New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, even the Guardian to an extent, or Le Monde, or some of the Bild Zeitung, stuff like that. This is stuff that gets read in ruling class circles, and so by reading it, what you're getting is an indication as to the conversations which do go on in these circles, and a lot of bullshit and propaganda. But as long as you read it with a view that what you're reading is the words of the enemy, then you can find some use for it. So here we have the New York Times, and this is a story from just the other day, and this is yesterday, in fact. So what this is, this article by a guy called Stephen Erlanger talks about is essentially like there is a version of the truth in here, because what Erlanger argues in this article is that Trump talks a lot, but little has actually changed, i.e. that there's no obvious progress, because what Trump's still demanding from Putin is that there is, again, the same Kellogg plan be implemented. So what Trump is still saying is that they want a ceasefire in the war, then talks. Now that, of course, is out of the question for the Russians. Now, the New York Times article, in typically lying style, says that, well, this is because the Russians want to do more land grabs, etc. Now, what it actually is that the reason why the Kellogg plan, which is still what Trump is working off, calls for a ceasefire before anything else, before any territorial swaps are carried out, before any political settlements are implemented. What this is doing is it's calling for essentially the Russians to stop the war. And what it will do is it will leave left unresolved the questions of NATO, the question of the nature of the Kiev regime, the question of the fascist elements in Ukraine, the question of the ability of the Western powers to insert troops into Ukraine. And we'll come to that when we talk about Britain later on. So for all those reasons, the question of we'll have a ceasefire and then talks, putting it that way around is a non-starter for the Russian side, because they know very well that the moment that they stop, the moment that they agree to the American demand for a unconditional ceasefire, is the moment that the Europeans will move to actually insert troops into Ukraine. They won't do it while the current special military operation is ongoing. They won't take the risk of getting, I mean, they've already had quite a number of men killed unofficially, but they won't take the risk of marching into Odessa or Lvov or Kiev when it's an active war zone. They need the pause in order to make the insertion of European troops, and it will be Europeans, though I doubt that if this plan went ahead that the Americans would have much to do with it themselves. But it will be an escalation of the situation, because it would essentially mean that the Russians then have another factor in to reckon with in their calculations, which is if the Starmer plan, and let's give Sir Keir, it's always important to give him his title, credit here. The Starmer plan depends upon the war stopping, and then flooding the Ukrainian side with troops. Now, what will those troops be there to do? That's an interesting question, and we'll come back to it later. But what they hope it will do is it will stabilize the Kiev regime, enable them to claim victory, and then get about the difficult process of rebuilding the Kiev regime and the Ukrainian industrial base and human base as well for another go at the Russians in a few years' time. That's the purpose of this. And again, we come back to the point. This was talked about under Biden when the Biden hierarchy, Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, etc., realized that they weren't going to be able to win on the battlefield. So this is, for all the talk from Trump and his defenders in the so-called multipolar media space, for all the talk about Trump's going to do this, Trump's going to do that, Trump's sick of Europe. Now, even if that were true, Trump cannot override the priorities of the entire American ruling class, or the great majority of it. Trump cannot override the entirety of the American political class. I mean, those who actually argue for an end to the war in Ukraine inside the chambers of the House of Representatives in the United States and the Senate, you could count them on the fingers of one hand. It would probably be Rand Paul in the Senate, maybe a couple of others, and it would be Thomas Massie in the House, maybe and probably Marjorie Taylor Greene, and that'd be about it. So you're looking at like what, no more than 5 to 10 at the outside people who could be reliably on side for a strategy of actually firmly bringing the war to an end. That's not enough. I mean, there's all this talk from the Democrats, and here we'll go back to the ridiculous No Kings protests, apparently led by their spiritual leader, Robert De Niro, in easily his least convincing role ever, and he's done some real shit in recent years. But the argument that, Trump's acting like a king, Trump is a dictator, etc. Trump is stymied continually when he threatens to impinge upon something the ruling class regards as important. Now, when he acts in the interest of the ruling class, of course, the president can do an awful lot. But even if Trump did have this vision, which some of these multipolar clowns on YouTube think that he did, which is that he's going to get out of Europe, he's going to focus on home affairs, he's going to secure our border, he's going to do this, he's going to do that, he's going to get out of Europe. This was all a fantasy. This was all a fantasy that these people believed, essentially thought that they could wish it into existence, because this is the problem with idealism. It leads you to believe all kinds of crazy and irrational and non-material things. Trump can't turn his back on Europe. Trump can't turn his back on the Ukraine war. Certainly not in a way that would end it on Russia's terms. That will not be allowed by the political elite in Washington, D.C. It will not be allowed by the wider U.S. ruling class. And it certainly won't be allowed by the Europeans. Now, there's a tendency, and maybe I've been guilty of this myself in the past, to just dismiss the European powers as unimportant. Now, next to China, next to Russia, next to the United States itself, that would be true as individual countries. But when you've got this codependent relationship between the United States and Europe, which has been there since at least 1945, there's an awful lot of money moving around there, an awful lot of markets at stake, an awful lot of resources at stake, an awful lot of money to be made. That's not something that an American president can turn his back on in a hurry. And again, I've argued this before, meaning that the words of the Europeans and their constant calls for only ending the war in a certain way or having the war continue, these words do actually carry weight in Washington, because there is a material basis for that relationship. There is a material basis upon which there is those relations between the US and the European side. And the US can't readily just turn away. And also the Europeans have plenty of supporters inside Washington, D.C., who have the same agenda as them. So Trump can't just say, you know what, you're all shit, I'm off. That would be very funny if he did, but he's not going to. And so what the New York Times article does correctly point out is that Trump essentially hasn't made any progress whatsoever. This is the same dance that Biden was engaged in, but with a slight twist in that Trump himself is prepared to go and meet with Putin directly. Now, the Russian side, we had statements made by Dmitry Peskov and the Russian Foreign Ministry saying that, like, next week, which is when the first rumors came out that there was going to be a summit meeting between Putin and Trump in Budapest, that was dismissed by Peskov as being too early, that there would need to be more preparation time put in, because what Trump and others in his inner circle seem to think that they could do is rapidly set up a meeting and bounce the Russians into agreeing to a ceasefire. That's not going to happen. It's not, because the Putin administration, the Putin system, can't agree to that. They can't leave the potential for NATO powers to occupy Ukraine, which is what they want to do if there's a ceasefire. They can't leave the potential for Ukraine to be shoved into the EU and NATO in the event of a ceasefire, which, again, that is what they would do. We'll come back to the British shenanigans over this in just a moment. So we are in a circle here. What happens is Trump says, well, maybe there should be a summit. Maybe. I mean, this Putin guy, I rather like it. And then what happens is the entire machinery of Washington, D.C., and the wider U.S. empire and its various different elements move into action and say, because Trump, of course, largely just agrees with whatever the last compelling person in the room told him. So they move into action. They deploy Zelensky, which maybe doesn't work, but then they deploy everybody else, like Mark Rutte is apparently going over to Washington, D.C. to say, listen, Mr. Trump, I promise you, this war can be won. That's actually more Sean Connery than Mark Rutte. It's just remarkable how those two flow into each other. But the point about it is that Rutte is going over there to essentially do what the Europeans always do. And again, this was pointed out in the New York Times article, that the Europeans say, "Oh, Trump, you're a genius. You're a genius. You will force peace in Ukraine just like you did it in the Middle East. Yes, you're a genius. You'll make sure there's a ceasefire, won't you? Yes, you're a genius." And the reason why they're doing that, it's not just because they're pathetic, even though that's true, pathetic individuals, because that works. This is them moving the goalpost, so to speak, by flattering Trump. It works again. Let's just go back to the material question again. When the Europeans do those kinds of things, it works because they have the real capital to back it up. They have the long-standing deep economic ties with the United States. They have very sympathetic ears, shall we say, in the DC establishment. It doesn't work when the Russians do it. When the Russians when Putin tries to tell Trump that he is a genius and his peace plan for Gaza was a great diplomatic triumph, which is absolutely nauseating, because there's no way that at least some of the people in the Putin administration actually believe that. I don't think Putin himself does. But again, this is the sort of Kirill Dmitriev approach of like saying, Mr. President, you are a peerless nationalistic genius. We are also peerless-based nationalistic geniuses. Here, look at this meme we produced. Maybe you and Vice President Vance can come over here and we can talk about how to restore Christian values. Or, maybe we could, invest more in your hotel chain, Mr. Trump. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Doesn't work when the Russians do it. Why? Because, again, you can't, in the end, fundamentally, you can't argue with the material needs of imperialism. Imperialism needs to maintain the very close relationship with the Europeans and the British. The imperialists need to conquer the Russians. That's, again, this is a need that they have. So no matter how much groveling the bourgeois in Russia think that they can do as part of their big master plan to convince Trump to just come on side and adopt their point of view or something, then it's this doesn't work. This doesn't work when the Russians do it, because imperialism, even though like there was a sort of idea amongst the Trump circle that they could pull off a sort of Nixon to China moment, or Trump to Moscow moment, things are too far gone for that. Just look at the stock market bubbles. Things are way too far gone. U.S. imperialism, even though it was already in a degree of trouble in 1972 to 73, was infinitely stronger back then than it is now. So there's no scope for the kind of like diplomatic bargaining that like a Nixon and a Kissinger could have done. It's victory or death, everybody. And it is the US-led side, the NATO side, needs to be able to present this war as a great triumph and an enduring one. If the Kiev regime implodes and NATO influence is chased out of Ukraine, then everybody will see it as a loss. If Trump gets his way and the ceasefire is forced on the Russians agree stupidly to a ceasefire before any other agreements, then the US and the Europeans will claim a great victory, and they would be right to, even if it's a temporary one, because that would be a loss for the Russians. And I think that the Putin and Lavrov and others do understand that. So the reason why there's going to be no meeting is because essentially there's nothing to talk about. Because Trump goes and says there should be a ceasefire. Putin says no for the following reasons. Trump says, very good conversation. Very good. Great. Amazing. What did you talk about, Mr. President? It was a great conversation. And then the whole process starts all over again. Then the Tomahawks will get delivered to Ukraine. There'll be a few spectacular hits with them. And then the Russians will wipe out the launchers. That's the thing. So this is the farce that is going to continue onwards for the next, well, however many months. So we've also got reporting in the Wall Street Journal today, which has said that that Trump is now dismissing any meeting with Putin as a quote unquote time. That's the thing. So the Russians say, well, we need to prepare for the meeting. To Trump quoted as on Air Force One to various reporters that this is a waste of time. Why is it a waste of time? Because the Russians made it clear that they're not going to concede on this ceasefire bullshit. So this is again a farce with Trump as its particular lead actor. So now this is of course linked to the latest shenanigans going on in perfidious Albion. Now I mentioned earlier on that our beloved leader Sir Keir Starmer is the one who has a plan that he's very keen on, which is deploy British forces into Ukraine. Now, this, of course, is a deception carried out by the British administration, carried out by Starmer, because what they do is they present it as if there's going to be a British, a French, German deployment into Ukraine at some point. And they don't say exactly when. At least the headlines don't say exactly when. So here, the latest, this is from just 2 days ago, reported on the BBC. Europe ready to deploy troops to Ukraine if ceasefire secured. Now, what John Healey, this clown who's the defense secretary here, says over and over again, is that there's going to be a European and American don't know if there'd be, there's probably not going to be an American one, but there's going to be a European and British deployment to Ukraine. They've said this over and over again. Starmer usually says things in press conferences like, we're ready to go, and usually involves him then quietly clarifying it, or at least quietly clarifying it later by saying that, oh, well, when we said that we'd deploy troops, we actually meant in the following circumstances, under the following conditions, blah, blah, blah. So what does Healy, and by extension Starmer, it goes back to the ceasefire demand I was talking about, which is that they need to be able to deploy troops to Ukraine. They have to essentially get the Russians to stop fighting in perpetuity. That's what is that's what they require. And here I'll bring in the interview given recently by Lord Richards, former commander-in-chief of the British Army, former commander of occupation forces in Afghanistan. Well, he's come out and given an interesting to the Independent newspaper, and basically confirmed certain things that I've said and that we've said on Decline and Fall, where he's come out and said the following, and I'll read to you from the article. Reflecting on Ukraine's chances of success against Russia, Lord Richards said, my view is that they would not win. The interviewer responds by saying, could not win even with the right resources. No, he replied. No, they haven't got the manpower. And so he knows very well. And by the way, if these former officers in Britain, America, elsewhere, they all know very well the reality, which is that, and the Richards comments upon it in the interview, where he says that there's some kind of war state almost exists between Britain and Russia, but it's not a shooting war. And also he makes the observation that the issue isn't existential to Britain, meaning that there's going to be no British troops deployed directly to fight the Russians. That's just something which isn't going to happen. Again, if Richards is coming out and giving this interview to the Independent, he'll be doing so on behalf of a certain faction within the British military. Now, if they all know damn well that they wouldn't have a chance of fighting the Russians, and going to, because it would lead to disaster, and senior officers in Britain and France and Germany and the United States all know that, then why do they keep talking about deploying? The answer is that they hope against hope that somehow that whatever shitty deal offered under the terms of the Kellogg plan, that the pro-peace or peace at any cost faction inside the Russian leadership will prevail and take that. Meaning that what would then happen, the British, the French, and everybody else that they could get to scramble some men into Ukraine would then send as big a force as they could muster into Ukraine, with the idea being that they then say that basically that this is now a NATO protectorate. That's what they would do. They would insert the troops. They wouldn't be peacekeepers. They would be there to secure the stability of the Kiev regime, to be able to Zelensky is the man who beat the Russians, and they would then, this is what they would hope, essentially bring what's left of Ukraine into into NATO by default and occupy it. Now, this is known to the Russians because it's John Healy and Keir Starmer and Macron all make these statements publicly. Russians know very well that this is something which is in the works, and they know very well what the consequences would be. So this isn't something that is going to be agreed to, because they can see what ultimately the American and European plan is, which is to make sure that the Kiev regime survives and to make sure that they can present whatever outcome comes from the negotiations as a victory for them. And if the Russians agreed, as I said before, to these terms, then it would be at least a partial victory for imperialism. If Russia agreed to the kind of terms that Trump is offering now, then the imperialists could legitimately say that they had ground the Russians down and had secured the future of a truly independent and free Ukraine. So these are all the reasons why the Russians won't ever agree to this, and the reasons why they will just keep on going with mostly the methods they're using at the moment until the Ukrainian regime gets drained to the point where it collapses. I mean, the longer this goes on, the more it becomes clear that the NATO side is just unable to sustain this level of effort. And here we get back to the question of resources, industrial capacity, etc. Because for all that Friedrich Merz keeps babbling away about how he's going to remilitarize Germany, well, that's not going to, even if he was able to do it, which, and I don't think he would be able to do that in the time allotted, which is he's thinking 5 years or so. Bear in mind, Volkswagen is already stopping production of certain models in like its Wolfsburg facility because they say they've run out of chips, computer chips. Now, due to the chip war, it would seem, with the Chinese, and this is it's starting to affect German industrial production. Chinese are already putting restrictions on the export of rare earth metals because they don't want the US and its bloc to be able to use these in expanded military production. So this is just the headline problem of today. But more specifically, and as I've covered this before, but the idea that Keir Starmer's Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron have, which is if you just give us 5 years, we'll be able to turn around European, British, and American defense industrial capacity. This is all a nonsense. This is all garbage because there's a reason why this declined and withered away in the first place, and it's due to the withering of the industrial base in the imperialist countries, which is a natural consequence of late-stage imperialism. So to turn that around, essentially, you would need to turn it around by direct and massive and ongoing state intervention into the defense sector, which many of these European countries just simply can't afford to do. They're already in a parlous financial situation. Need to essentially implement the kind of like controls over industry production and resource management that haven't been seen anywhere in the West since World War II. So they don't have the expertise to do it either. They just about had it in the Second World War and for a little time afterwards, but it's long since disappeared. The knowledge base is gone. So this fantasy that they can turn it around in 4 or 5 years and then come back and have another go at the Russians later with a refloated Kiev regime, this is all nonsense. Russians probably know it is, but there's no reason to let the Europeans and the Americans claim a victory that that it is not necessary to let them claim. So the British plan, the usual and blustering from John Healey, this is all a deception, which depends upon the Russians actually committing political suicide by agreeing to terms outlined by Trump, which of course would only be focused upon preserving the Kiev regime. Does raise the question for the Russians, though, which is that are they going to continue using the same methods? But also, how long are they prepared to go on grinding through thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainians whilst the Kiev regime still continues to exist. There will reach a point when they will have to make a decision about what they're going to do to the Kiev regime. Because if it can't be negotiated with, which it can't because it has no independent capacity, it has no independence to negotiate, it is purely a creature in the United States, but also with the French and the Germans being involved as well. Now, the Kiev regime does not represent an independent political actor, not really. It has the ability to make demands, to make a lot of noise, and to cause political embarrassment to Trump. And it has, but it only has that because the Europeans and a big section of the American establishment have tied themselves to it. And so to now admit that their puppet regime is run by a coked up lunatic and can't win the war, that's something which is not acceptable to those in power. The Kiev gang, and it is a gang, it's essentially a group of chancers, looters, thieves, bandits. They know that there is a serious political investment in them by London, by Paris, by Berlin and Washington. And so they leverage that to their advantage. They know that they can make certain demands. They know that they can demand money. And they know that if it is not forthcoming, they still have a lot of media friends in the West who can run tons of negative stories, who can get questions asked in parliaments, etc., about why the West is betraying the brave and heroic President Zelensky, etc. So a puppet regime does not have the capacity to defy its paymaster in Washington or in London. It does have the capacity to make demands of its paymaster, though, because of the investment that's been made in it. And to actually break with the Kiev regime, cut it off and say, no more money, no more weapons, no more nothing, that's not something that Trump has the capability or the inclination to do. Because even if he did want to do that, as I said, the entire political machine of Washington, D.C. would be mobilized against him. And he can't stand up to that kind of pressure because fundamentally he doesn't have the necessary political skills to do that. And also he's a very weak man, fundamentally. He says one thing one day, another thing the next day, another thing the day after that, largely depending upon who he's been talking to at any particular time. This is not somebody who's going to defy the entirety of the political hierarchy in Washington, no matter what the Democrats say, or no matter what Trump himself says. This isn't real. This, like Trump's a dictator stuff, this is, politics as filtered through the Netflix generation's love Facey's House of Cards. Now, there's an unmentionable name. This is this is nonsense. Again, like what we are seeing here is the dance that continues to go on. All of the plans of the Europeans depend upon essentially the Russians making an incredibly stupid and ridiculous decision that destroys themselves. And that's not going to happen. Right. So, final item on the agenda for today. A certain Bernard Sanders has been out and about again. Clearly, the Democratic Party's trying to deploy salvage something. And so he was on the Daily Show recently with, the Liberals' last favorite comedian, Jon Stewart. Though, in fairness, he is a far better comedian than his successor, the execrably unfunny Trevor Noah. This exchange, Stewart asked Sanders, how do you feel now Trump is implementing some of your policies? Now, what Stewart's referring to is the fact that Trump took stakes in a couple of different companies recently, just claimed like a 10% stake in them. Trump is trying to direct an industrial revival, carrying out partial nationalizations, etc. And so Stewart asks Sanders, well, isn't it frustrating for you that Trump is enacting more of your policies than the Democrats are? Now, Of course, the certain lunatic and unhinged characters on MSNBC would then probably start screaming that Trump is a Bolshevik. It doesn't really reveal that Trump has adopted some kind of radical anti-capitalist agenda. What it actually reveals is that Sanders isn't a socialist. He's not a social democrat. He's basically just a New Deal liberal, and it also reveals that the start things like policies like nationalization or partial nationalization, state-directed production plans, which again Trump and his entourage have talked about a little bit, but hasn't really happened. None of these represent socialism. Nationalization or federalization, if you're in the United States, I suppose, doesn't represent change. It's there's been various different regimes, capitalist regimes that have existed over the last 100 years, which have engaged in nationalizations. It is mainly done for one of several reasons. One, to take a prize asset or prime asset out of the hands of a foreign power. That's what the reason why the Dutch took that microprocessor production company off the Chinese the other day. It was done essentially to stymie Chinese progress in essentially coming to dominate the European microprocessor market. So that's certainly not a move towards socialism. It's also done to prevent key areas of production going out of business because the private owners are essentially going bust. So you might see various different countries nationalize things like oil infrastructure, gas infrastructure, etc. Because if they didn't, then the private owners would drive it; it would go out of existence. So you see, this is also why, like the Starmer administration did a sort of partial nationalization of certain bits of the steel, though by no means all of it. Mainly that was a political move, but also they needed to secure a certain amount of steel for domestic industrial projects. None of this is socialism. None of it is. Because none of it actually goes near to threatening the bases of ruling class power. And it's nationalization done purely on the basis of maintaining the relation production that exists under capitalism. It's just that the state then runs it as the owner and the manager. The actual conditions for the workforce might not even improve very much, may even get worse under state management. So state control of a particular industry does not equal socialism. And many people believe that it does, of course, but that is due to the abysmal way in which social democrats mainly, but also revisionists, have represented what socialist change looks like. It's not just a few nationalizations and a higher tax rate. This is, at best, that's social democracy. And again, like even very pro-parties and very pro-capitalist politicians can do these things. It might make sense for a while for the purposes of industrial development to have like big nationalized sections of the economy because private capital won't invest in risky areas. And so you find that in some of the models of development used in Taiwan, for instance, in South Korea, under American military occupation, at least one of those is, you find like nationalizations occurring or national development plans because even capitalist politicians, capitalist class is unreliable in terms of doing the things that it says it does, which is taking risky investments. In actual fact, they're very unwilling to do that. So none of this stuff that Stuart mentioned to Sanders is stuff that like actually represents socialist change. And the reason why Sanders looked embarrassed was because on one level, then he knows that. It's also embarrassing on a more basic level that on the face of it, Stuart's claim is right, which is like Trump is more keen on doing a certain amount of economic intervention than the leadership of the Democrats was. There was certain Democrats under Biden favored it, but most of the Democrats did not. given that most of the Democrats are still tied mainly to like the Wall Street interest in industrial intervention. So the other key and telling admission from Sanders was that when he was asked about why he's defending the Affordable Care Act, which he admits is just a giant subsidy to the health insurance industry, he says, "Well, you know, we need Medicare for all." I'll do the impression to make it more real. We need Medicare for all right now. But he admits in his priorities that he's not pushing for that. He's defending the Affordable Care Act, which was useless, was a giant subsidy for the health insurance industry, and which many working class Americans hate. And this is the politics of your American social democracy. And as somebody points out in the comments, well, Sanders would barely be like a Nixon era Republican. In fact, like the economic policies of Nixon, more radical than anything Bernie Sanders has done. But that just shows what the various different strengths of the contending classes were in America in the 70s, and the fact that a Republican administration would do things like price freezes. Of course, Nixon accompanied it with wage freezes, but even that they would do something like that shows that the strength of the American working class movement back then was, of course, much higher in terms of its capacity to struggle than it is now. And the Social Democrats slide down with it when that happens. When the decline happened, the decline in the labor movement related politicians, such as New Deal Democrats, Social Democrats, etc., went right down with it, because the limit of these people's horizons is what is permissible from the point of view of the ruling class. The only thing that's permissible from the point of view of the American ruling class right now is the sort of rather needy defense of Obamacare. Certainly not the advance towards what the thing that Sanders proclaims he believes in, but in actual fact makes no move towards actually pushing for, which is Medicare for all, which under the current balance of forces, under the current system, is not going to be enacted. So Sanders, the usual embarrassment, the usual nonsense, embarrassed by, of all people, John fucking Stewart. So going to take a brief break now to pause for more beverages for myself. So we'll be back with the discussion of the what I'm going to call the base superstructure fallacy. So come back to us in 10 minutes and we will begin that discussion. Also, queue up your questions in the chat. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. And I'll be back with you in 10 minutes for the next part of the program.
căzut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Okay, everybody, we are back, and we are going to be looking at the question of the base superstructure fallacy, so to speak, and the way in which academics, media types, etc., present Marxism as basically being narrow, crude materialism, mechanistic materialism. And of course, the dialectical materialist method is much more subtle, complex, and ultimately accurate than that in terms of its ability to interpret and understand events. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk a little bit about the way in which Marx and Engels themselves saw this, and this is a couple of things I'm going to read out to you. One of which is from Anti-Düring, the seminal text of Engels, where he finds the Marxist system or the dialectical material worldview, so to speak, against his opponent Jürgen Düring. And another one is from a later letter by Engels to Joseph Bloch. Now, in Anti-Düring, Engels, when he's talking about the materialist conception of history, has the following to say, quote, "The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life, and next to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure, that in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insight into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are sought not in the philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch." So that's the basis there of the materialist conception of history, the dialectical materialist worldview, which is that you have to start your analysis with an analysis of how are the essentials of life produced, how are they distributed, and therefore what is the mode of production, what are the relations of production, and how are the commodities that are produced actually distributed around the region, the country, the world. That has to be the starting point of any analysis. Now ask yourselves this: how many Marxist groups that you know actually do that analysis these days? The answer is, of course, very, very few. So that's the basis for the Marxist conception of like historical development. But it is not just crude materialism. And Engels later went on to go into this in a little bit more detail. This is from a letter he wrote to Joseph Bloch in 1890, so after Marx's death, 7 years after Marx's death. Engels says the following: according to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. More than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its results, to wit, constitutions established by the victorious class after a successful battle, etc., juridical forms, and even the reflexes of all these actual struggles in the brains of the participants, political, juristic, philosophical theories, religious views, and their further development into systems of dogmas also exercise their influence upon the course of historical struggles, and in many cases preponderate in determining their form. This is an interaction of all these elements in which, amid all the endless host of accidents, that is, of things and events whose inner interconnection is so remote or so impossible of proof that we can regard it as non-existent, as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary. Otherwise, the application of the theory to any period of history would be easier than the solution of a simple equation of the first degree. We make our history ourselves, but in the first place, under very definite assumptions and conditions. Among these, the economic ones are ultimately decisive, but the political ones, etc., and indeed even the traditions which haunt human minds also play a part, although not the decisive one. So, what does Engels mean there? Is he renouncing the materialism there? No, of course he's not. What he's saying in the letter is an expansion upon what he has said in that previous earlier quote. And what he means there is that the element here, the means by which commodities or the essentials of life and other commodities are produced, who controls that production, who controls that distribution of commodities, who profits from it ultimately. This is these are the basis upon which societies are organized, but it is not a sort of simple 1 + 1 = 2 thing going on here. It's not capitalist society, shall we say, capitalist production relations plus capitalist distribution of commodities added together equals bourgeois democratic state, because that just doesn't work. There are many differences even inside the imperialist bloc as to the kind of regimes that exist and the kind of legal systems that they have and the kind of cultures that they generate. And Engels's point is, we, as way back to Marx and Engels themselves, and including Lenin and Stalin and Mao in this, none of these great leaders of the Marxist tradition, including its originators and those who adapted it to their various different local specificities, none of them have ever argued that for the economic determinist point of view, that kind of crude thinking came to, it has always been present, which is why, of course, Engels felt the need to argue, but that kind of thinking comes mainly from the sides of revisionism, both right opportunism in the form of like Khrushchev, in the form of social democracy, etc., but also in left opportunism, who will do things like arguing that the mere presence of any kind of market relation inside a worker state renders it no longer a worker state, and capitalism has been fully, which is strange how the ultra left and the revisionist right wing often end up almost agreeing with each other on certain things. So the point here is that when we seek to understand, or should we say, we seek to analyze things via the Marxist worldview, capitalist state equals capitalist state equals therefore this system of relations, and it is always going to be the same because its root is capitalism. Well, that's just simply not true. So, like American capitalism, for instance, yes, it was for a century the most dynamic form of capitalism, but is it simply a carbon copy British capitalism, given that the British invested quite heavily into the industrial base in the United States? And the answer is, of course, no. And not only is there differences in industrial organization and technique, there's also important cultural differences in how US workplace is run, in how the US state is run, differences in how the United States ruling class justifies itself in terms of the perpetual lie that this is America, anybody can make it in America. We aren't bound by the old outdated conventions of the Europeans. America is free from class division. You know, if you're in the United States, you'll have heard all of this from school, etc. All of this, like we'll call it politico-cultural side of things. This is, of course, generated by the unique specificities of American history, and to dismiss it as just simply froth is untrue. Now, if you remember what Lenin said about theory, which is that it becomes a material force when it grips the masses. Well, the same is true, not just in terms of Marxist Leninist theory. It's also true in terms of ruling class theories. Bourgeois ideology becomes a material force when it grips. If you observe recent events in the United States, you can see how this is true. Bourgeois ideology, unfortunately, given our point of view, bourgeois ideology can bring millions of people out onto the streets of the United States. Same's true in Britain, or at least hundreds of thousands. Same's true in France. Bourgeois ideology can motivate people to go along to a protest organized ultimately by and financed by Wall Street billionaires and claim it's a protest for the people. Bourgeois ideology can still motivate a mass movement. Again, and that's a material force. And this is why Lenin's phrase cuts both ways, because on the one hand, you have the ability of Marxist-Leninist theory to become a material force when it grips the masses, but equally, as we can see from observing the imperialist bloc, bourgeois ideology can do that now more than we can, unfortunately. But you have with the No Kings protest, and this is why it's an interesting example, is a case of bourgeois ideology doing just that. And this becomes, of course, a material force. Why does it become a material force? Because the mass movements become a material because they cannot help but become a factor in the decision-making process of various different political actors. And when the bourgeoisie cynically manipulates people into turning out on men, they are, of course, fully aware these protests are a material force because they hope that this can lead to material developments in the political realm, meaning that they can push this energy that they hope to unleash via the No Kings process into real world political developments, such as the revival of the Democratic Party. So what we mean by theory becoming a material force when it grips the masses. This is how bourgeois ideology works. Lenin, of course, theorized it properly when talking about how this can be used by the Revolutionary Party, but at the moment it's used by the bourgeoisie themselves. And it's not just in terms of protests. Bourgeois ideology is a material force because bourgeois ideology is in the consciousness of the proletariat, whether we are in old perfidious, whether we are in United States or France or Germany. bourgeois imperialist ideology still is a material force because it grips the mind of the proletariat itself. It prevents the development of the it works to prevent the development of class consciousness. The way in which this works, of course, is that though there are some within the system, within the bourgeois system, who are, of course, fully aware of the way we need to constantly retard the consciousness of the proletariat, and therefore are fully aware of the fact that they need to throw all kinds of ideology into the mix to make sure that the move from, as to use Marx's old Hegelian-inspired definitions from the Poverty of Philosophy, the move from being a class in itself to being a class for itself is restricted as much as possible. The move beyond that to be to obtaining revolutionary consciousness, that is something which is never actually obtained. And they do that by making sure that class consciousness is diverted down all kinds of different avenues. And again, like, you can tell that this is something that they take seriously due to the money and resources that they put into the propaganda machine every year. So, of course, the ultimate root of all these bourgeois ideologies is, of course, the bourgeois production and bourgeois relations of production. And the way in which that we need to run this is guided by, of course, our understanding of how these relations of production filter through into how the working class lives and what the state of consciousness of the working class is. So all the different elements here, the cultural elements, the ideological elements, legal elements, all of which goes essentially to make up real material forces, which are barriers to class consciousness. And so we can't, unfortunately, just say you need to unite the working class. Well, as we've said many times before, on what basis are you uniting the working class? Are you going to try and unite the working class around the basis of Bernie Sanders' weak source social democracy? Are you going to try and unite the working class around a revival of European social democracy? Well, that won't work. See, there's plenty of ways you can try and unite the working class, but if it's done on the basis of bourgeois ideologies, which is what social democracy ultimately is, then it's something which is not going to go very well. It's something which isn't going to work. So to go back to the Engels quote, then, what does this ultimately the way in which dialectical materialism can analyze any particular event? Well, let's use the example of the Ukrainian regime. Now, it's something which has been described by many, including me at various times, as a puppet, as a regime which simply exists to carry out the whims of its sponsors. Now, this is true to a certain extent, because the material basis for the Ukrainian regime is the withered and form of Ukrainian capitalism, which has always been a very weak and very feeble creation. And it's usually unable to actually exert itself in an independent fashion. We always sought sponsors. Now, again, this doesn't mean that Ukrainian petty bourgeois nationalism, Banderism, Ukrainian fascism isn't a material force, even if it's based on a very sort of weedy Ukrainian capitalism. So, like, if you look at like the propaganda of like nationalists, which is all sort of paganistic stuff, weird Tolkienistic rip-offs, appeals to a sort of mythical past and even more mythical future. This is, of course, stuff which exists. This is sort of reactionary idealism in the extreme, but it becomes something of a material force because it is able to appeal to a certain number of lumpenized former proletarians, of radicalized petty bourgeoisie in Ukraine. It will never become the force that the Ukrainian Banderists, or some of the more sincere of them, wish it to become. Because even if you can, using this form of reactionary, very reactionary idealist thought, even if you can motivate a certain number of petty bourgeois and lumpens to your organization and even fight for you for a while, ultimately, even though you can do that, you can't escape the material weakness of Ukrainian capitalism. So you can organize quite powerful reactionary movements within like a weakened country that can, unfortunately, crush opposition to them. But ultimately, you can't escape the material reality. And the material reality is that the Ukrainian nationalism, in its sort of banderistic form, is based on a very, very weak Ukrainian capitalism, whose owners, whose controlling class, shall we say, the Ukrainian capitalist class, the Ukrainian oligarchy, basically decided, due to their very weak situation in the 90s, that they would pursue a strategy initially of relations with both the Russians and the West, then ultimately just went all in with the West. And this means that Ukrainian capitalism is now entirely dependent upon outside powers. So to go back to the ideological point, Ukrainian fascism can organize people, can motivate them to fight, can get them out with guns to kill, based on the bullshit ideas of Bandera, Sheikhovich, etc. But ultimately, it can't change what they're really fighting for, because what they're really fighting for isn't the stuff that's in about, Tolkienistic, elvish paradises fighting off the hordes of orcs. What they're really fighting for, even if they don't know it, is a Ukraine which is dominated by the imperialist powers, which is owned and controlled by the imperialist powers, because that's all that Ukrainian capitalism is capable of being. Now, let's go back to the question of, well, what do these people think that they're fighting for? Does it matter? Well, on the one level, yes, it does, because what a man thinks he's fighting for is important to understand why a movement starts to go forward, why a movement takes a grip, even if it on a certain chunk of the masses, even if it's not the majority. Why does that succeed? Those things have to be interrogated. What appeal does it have? That has to be understood. But it also has to be understood that ultimately fascism can't escape its material origins, even though, of course, fascism in its various different forms is all about denying the importance of the material. Fascism, but you see this with both Mussolini and Hitler. Mussolini was more expansive about this, but I think Hitler was too in his speeches. The fascists always claim that the Marxists are narrow economic determinists. They don't believe in heroism. They don't believe in the strength of the individual to go forward and battle against the odds and win. This is, of course, all nonsense. What else would you expect from the fascists? But what the fascists prove is that for all of their histrionics, for all of their melodramatic posing, for all of their neo-paganism and all their cruelties and their savageries, they can't escape the material origin point. So Mussolini, for all of his shirtless antics, clearing brush or clearing marshland, or pretending to, for all of his pomposity, couldn't actually escape it, not only Italian capitalism, but also the weakness of the Italian central state. Like Mussolini was able to be dismissed as prime minister and removed for all the fact that he apparently led a many hundreds of thousands of strong national fascist party. They dismissed him because Mussolini, in the end, was unable to overcome the historic weaknesses of Italian capitalism and was ultimately a servant of Italian capital for all the nonsense that he engaged in, for all the screaming and the shouting and the jumping up and down and all of the melodrama of Mussolini. In the end, he was just dismissed, gone. Set up in the north under a Hitlerite puppet regime. But again, to come back to the point, the fascists, and not just them, but all kinds of like reactionary bourgeois ideology, can motivate people, can recruit people, can mobilize them. But ultimately, these movements cannot escape their origin point. And the origin point is our capitalist relations of production. That's the fundamental start and end point. It's not to say, and this is go back to Engels' point, it's not to say that all of the other points in the middle, in between the start and the end point, don't matter. That there isn't, that there aren't areas of struggle there. That there isn't important things that motivate the various different individuals and motivate mass movements in the cultural and the political and the juridical realm. It's just that you cannot, these bourgeois movements powered by bourgeois ideology, can't escape their origin points and will always collapse back into them in the end. Now, at this point, we will bring in the point of view of those who say, yes, something can be a bourgeois movement, something can be a bourgeois political organization or based on bourgeois ideology. But if it motivates the masses, then we should be there amongst them. So this is references back to the no king shit the other day. Well, the point is that and again, like Lenin covered this in some of his writings when he talks about the need to mobilize wherever the working class is. Yes, you should do that. But the point here, we get to the point about tailism, because to actually properly organize amongst the masses who are who are part of bourgeois movements, then you actually need to engage with them on the basis that you want to get them to break with the bourgeois movement. Not that you want to tail end it. Not that you just say, well, we see what the bourgeoisie is saying and we'll do it better. No, you actually need to be, if possible, talking to workers and saying, we understand your motivations, but this is ultimately the wrong way to go. And will most workers be willing to hear that for straight away? No, they won't. Will it be something that you might plant a seed and they'll come back? They'll think about it in when the material conditions change. Well, it'll be the case. At the moment, all we can do at the moment is plant such seeds. But the point about it is that, and as here we go back to Engels, like the Marxist point of view starts with the analysis of the material, real world conditions of production and distribution. But it doesn't end there. There's not then a straight line to the conclusion of what the ideal manifestation is. That depends on all these different stages in between. And to actually understand what various forces are, one has to analyze and understand all those different elements in between. But it ultimately is the case that these bourgeois political movements, parties, etc., whether they're liberals, so-called conservatives, fascists, none of them can actually escape the material origin point. They can change it. They can bend it in certain directions, shall we say, like Hitlerism in Germany, certainly towards the very end of the war, started to actually try to, shall we say, change the rate of production in Germany, even if they weren't very successful at that. They certainly tried to implement like a war economy. But for a very, very long time in World War II, they were still trying to persist with the hands-off method of economic management they've been doing in the 1930s. One of the unspoken things about Hitlerism is how much of a libertarian's paradise 1930s Germany was. We'll come back to that in future episodes. The point is, though, that even Hitlerism, even for all that some elements within it believed that they were changing the material base of German capitalism, we believe that they were at least reorganizing it, were unable to do so. They weren't able to escape their origin point. That's the thing. So we'll come back to this in future episodes, but it's important to understand, and this goes back to the question about relations between puppet states and their masters. It's important to understand that nothing is ever just completely straightforward. Even puppet states, even states which could not exist, like modern Ukraine or modern Israel, which could not exist without the largesse of the imperialist powers, even they have a certain amount of power within the imperialist system because there's been so much invested in them. Because if they were to go down, then it would be a devastating defeat for imperialism. And that gives even rulers like Zelensky, who, again, could not exist without the US, British, and the Europeans bankrolling the Ukrainian state. But it does give him a certain amount of bargaining power, just the same way as with Netanyahu, who's a much more important figure than Zelensky, has a certain amount, a large amount of bargaining power with the United States, because he and those who back him understand that if Israel goes down, then that's devastating for US power in West Asia. And that gives, again, Netanyahu and whoever the Israeli prime minister is, but particularly someone who knows the game like he does, a large amount of bargaining power with any US politician, which is why they can go as far as they do in terms of demanding things from the US. Now, and it's why also, like, it doesn't matter to an extent, like how much Zelensky or Netanyahu pisses off the occupant of the White House, because they're both uniquely repellent individuals. The fact is that there is so much materially at stake for US imperialism in both cases that the puppet regime does have a degree of negotiating power, which is why, and that's important to understand. It takes a dialectical materialist level of understanding to properly interpret what the nature of puppet regimes is, because if you just take it as, well, why doesn't the US cut off Israel tomorrow? Well, there would be real world consequences of that with regard to the global position and profitability ultimately of US imperialism. Same with Zelensky. Why doesn't the US just cut off this bad guy Zelensky? He's bad for America. Well, no, he's not. The success of the war on Russia is vital for the revival of US imperialism. So this is the true nature of puppet regimes, and it takes that a dialectical materialist understanding to actually properly understand the back and forth between the colonial outposts of the empire and the imperial center. So going to move now into the question and answer section, and be sure to what I'll do is the big questions I will note down and put them into the future Q&A. Anything I can just answer immediately, I will do so. Let's go right back up to the top. Hello to Svetlana, Davey, Jerry, Jay, Brolin, Down with Zionist. Everybody's name has been changed, by the way. That's one of YouTube's delightful little innovations. So, hello to Dallas Ken. Hello to, I believe it used to be Lurtis. Now it's Anbira. Hello to Chris in Hong Kong. Pavel. In answer to your question, Q&A probably Saturday. Not sure for now. I'll have to confirm that. Down with Zionist asks, comrades, do you know any good communist party in Japan? The Japanese Communist Party is utterly degenerated into parliamentary revisionism. Japanese Labour Party seems pretty good. I must admit that Japan is an area that I know a little bit about, but not nearly as much as I should do. I'm familiar with like Japanese Red Army, and stuff like that. Jay Galt, M4XU, is regretting their political past, which is expressed in their YouTube name. Well, I'm just glad that YouTube didn't exist when I was an anarchist, because I'd have probably called myself, I don't know, Goonin or something really stupid like that. So I'm going to take a note of the question about Japanese Communist Party, Labour Party, etc., and I'll come back to it in the Q&A, etc. So yes, as Christopher Rogers points out, a new episode of Decline and Fall was posted this morning. Would have been posted last night, but there was an incredibly abysmal internet speed in Glasgow at the moment. I'm going to blame late stage imperialism for this. Was uploaded today, so do check that out. It's an interview with the Serbian-Canadian filmmaker Boris Malagurski about the neo-colonial administration of Bosnia. So do check that out. More episodes of Decline and Fall will be recorded on Friday of this week, so be sure to tune in for those. So hello to Speedy Bozo. Not sure you used to have another name, but you're from Perfidious Albion's Northern Hills. T.G. Wilson, good afternoon to you. Hello to again Svetlana. Right. Hello to Daniel. Hello to just another site who says China has started mass production of quantum radars, potentially rendering all Western stealth technologies obsolete. How long before advances like this render Western militaries totally non-competitive? Well, I'll try and respond, but again, with a withered industrial base, this does have a knock-on effect. So, for instance, there was this idea that we've talked about before here that was dominant in Western societies in the 1990s and 2000s, that under the globalized system, that that there would be a certain amount of production done by the simple production of commodities would be done in China, or would be done in Indonesia, or to a certain extent Vietnam as well, maybe the Philippines, and that the complex high technology stuff will be retained in the West. The problem with that assumption was that it misunderstood what generates a scientific and technological base and what sustains it. The idea that you could sustain your technological advantages when your industrial base had been stripped out, and you were essentially just trying to become like a high-tech production hub as part of like a globalized supply chain. Well, it turned out that that was a fallacy. That didn't work because the Chinese, quite smartly and quite correctly, insisted on technology sharing, had it written in to their agreements with the various different Western firms, and therefore by studying the various forms of technology in which they were lagging behind the Western imperialist powers, this helped them, building on the very solid foundations established in the Maoist period. This helped them build up a scientific and technological base that was far more powerful than anything the Europeans had to offer, and far more powerful than now that which exists in the United States. So yes, they'll probably try and compete with this, but the Chinese are now running ahead in leaps and bounds with regard to technological innovations. In certain areas, the Americans are still just about keeping up. But if they've got something, as this comment from Just Another Parasite says they have, which is quantum radars, I'll look this up. I also then this is going to be a potential game changer in terms of it would render any attempt to go into war with China almost impossible, because you wouldn't be able to fly any aircraft against them, which is interesting. There's also talk of the Chinese developing like a comprehensive system of like submarine detection, which would render the US's submarine strategy as well. Again, something I need to do more research on. Apparently, YouTube is misbehaving today. Not exactly a surprise. I think part of these problems with the internet started with the Amazon the other day. I don't think the British side of this has quite recovered from it yet. So, hello to Michael McGoldrick from Ireland. And who else we got here? Cataclysm, Irish Partisan. Pavel says, how do we even organize if the next crash potentially kills off the rest of the existing economy in the UK and Europe? Depending, I do not see much proletariat left to organize. Let me see. I mean, that's a good question. I'll answer it briefly now and potentially expand upon it in the next Q&A. It won't kill the entirety of the economy off. I don't think. It'll be bad. I think that what will, I'm getting into guesswork now. What the Europeans and the Americans will be forced to do when the next crash comes, a series of liquidations and mergers of banks and hedge funds, etc. And ultimately, they'll be left with two choices. Either you allow thousands upon thousands of major corporations to go bankrupt, and then you get a dangerous amount of people becoming unemployed and unable to afford the essentials of life, which could happen. Or the alternative is that the US in particular, because they have the capability, more capability to do this than any others, would have to essentially nationalize large elements of the financial structure, because that will be the only choice to stop total collapse. You see, the capitalists require the destruction of means of production, the destruction of commodities, the destruction of capital, the destruction of labor. But the problem is, too far with that, you end up just in a whole system. So it's a very unstable thing, this kind of collapse. We'll probably end up with an awful lot of essentially state control having to be established, which, to go back to my previous point, does not mean the dawning of the age of socialism. What it means is that there'll be a desperate maneuver made by the US and its allies to try and stabilize the situation by essentially the state taking on the responsibility for a lot of these firms that hover on the edge of bankruptcy, especially if they're in a key economic area. There's certain areas which they just will not allow to go bankrupt. Now, that will be difficult if the economy is in fucking free fall, but I don't think it's going to be the case that there's going to be no proletariat left to organize. I think it's going to be literally like something out of like the end times. It's going to be bad, and there's going to be an awful lot of redundancies, and the capitalists are going to try and use it to reorganize production. Of course, they always do, but it's not going to be the apocalypse. I don't think. I think there's a danger in what some of the sort of multipolarist tie in, which is that they, particularly on YouTube, will a video like "Game Over" with an AI version of Putin knocking over a chess piece, and Ursula von der Leyen melting or something. There's a danger with some of the talk they engage in that people who are developing their critical faculties, if you're listening to like some of these people, will start to believe that the collapse will come in an almost like sick, cartoonish fashion. Should be emphasized that even in the Great Depression, like where there was mass unemployment, this was still not the sort of apocalyptic world hellscape that it is popularly portrayed as. There was a lot of poverty. It could have led to serious destabilization had the US capitalist class not taken decisive measures to defuse it. But it's never quite the sort of Mad Max hellscape that people expect. And if you expect like that kind of hellscape to emerge, then you're not able to prepare properly. Now we can investigate further how this is going to potentially look, but I think the way the ruling class will try and get the way it will get out of it is further consolidation of ownership, further consolidation of key sectors of the economy, huge state intervention to preserve key sectors of the economy. Now, there's no guarantee that any of this will work, of course, and it will present certain opportunities because it will reveal just how bankrupt capitalism is. And it's been bankrupt for many, many, many years now. And this is why I think that we have to do the important work now, which is understanding where the economy actually is, how it functions, and what the collapse will likely do, rather than just rely on phrases. That's what a lot of Marxist groups know now. Pavel's question is good, and I will make a note of it for a future program. Can we entitle this "The Coming Collapse"? Hello to Jenny. Hello to Dan from Stockholm. Hello, Space Lord 1913. Putin's pandering getting him anywhere. That's correct. Fortunately, pandering costs nothing in financial terms, and it won't do anything to actually help the Russian case. Trump has, as I've said over and over again, no capability of defying the overall aims of imperialism. I'm just flipping through the comments. Remember when Sean Penn said that we should not be concerned about the threat of nuclear war? Look, the nuclear war thing is another case of revisionists, Soviet revisionists, and their friends and maybe sometime collaborators in the multipolarist media sphere in the West, essentially building up a degree of hysteria around the nuclear war question. You see about 10 videos a week from various different channels saying nuclear war now, usually with Scott Ritter's face over the top of it. And this is something which has always been politically poorly handled, I would say. The imperialists would have loved to have kept their nuclear monopoly. But they, of course, very fortunately could not. They did have a plan to go after the Soviet Union in, I think it was Operation Unthinkable, nuking several Soviet cities. Never went ahead. The Soviet Union caught up with them very quickly. And the Soviet leadership under Khrushchev started doing this method of hysterically claiming that the only priority was preventing nuclear war at all costs. That was a deliberate overstatement designed to cover up for a collapse into revisionism of the communist parties in the imperialist nations. And the aim of it overall was to disempower the communist parties in the West and to make it clear to the imperialist powers that the Soviet Union was no longer interested in revolutions in their countries and was no longer going to insist upon, as it tried to do in the Stalin period, the adoption of Marxism-Leninism proper implementation of it by the communist parties in the West, and all of them just collapsed into revisionism. The point about this is that in the imperialist countries, the revisionist parties always emphasized, "Oh my God, we need to prevent nuclear war. Nuclear war's around the corner, etc., etc." If the imperialists thought they could get away with nuking their enemies and off scot-free, they'd do it. They know they can't. They know they can't. People in the ruling class circles, and again, let's go back to Engels's point about the need to analyze these circles properly. Like, they're cruel, manipulative, ruthless, gangster-like. Yes, all of the above. But fundamentally, like, they're not stupid. They're not completely stupid. They're not going to blow up the world. Again, no more system, no more profits, no more nothing. And you can't, by the way, no matter what Elon Musk or some of the other characters think, that you can't wait this out in a bunker in New Zealand when most of the markets you operated in no longer exist because everybody's dead. This isn't profitable stuff. This isn't a profitable line to engage in. Now, the nuclear war hysteria that you see every day on like the fucking Judge Napolitano channel, or Danny Haifong also indulges in this stuff, usually involving Scott Ritter. This is hysterical nonsense, which doesn't promote a good level of understanding. It promotes like hysteria, and that doesn't enable you to understand the situation properly. It doesn't enable you to actually properly understand the contradictions that come when you have various different countries with nuclear weapons. I mention those channels because now these are channels with the reach into the hundreds of thousands and the millions, unfortunately. And all it does is promote depression and disempowerment amongst people, thinking that the nuclear war is right around the corner. The Russians aren't going to engage in it. The US isn't going to engage in it either. There's a question as to whether they even could. So, moving on. Daniel says, a highlight for me yesterday was Ed Davey babbling about what Putin has on Trump, what's making him bully Zelensky into accepting a deal that hands victory to Russia. Well, Ed Davey is an opportunistic swine, leader of the English Liberal Democrats. Nowhere near as funny as Vladimir Zhirinovsky's Liberal Democrats in Russia, of course. Now, the question of blame it on Putin, this is an interesting one, because now the British ruling class and their politicians are just doing that with everything. They've now settled upon the idea that it was Putin who promotes migration into Britain, just as apparently it's Putin which causes, I don't know, the internet to slow down, the light bulb to break, the bus to turn up late. This is the usual. This is the usual nonsense that gets engaged in by the ruling class. Ed Davey is, of course, thinking that he might get into a coalition government pretty soon, so he's got to prove that he's on board with all the usual bullshit. Right. Dan Lindstrom says, today, Zelensky political military Saab show of theatre. Swedish workers, citizens, shut up and pay your rulers. Good old Sweden. A bastion of neutrality. Right. Moving on. Yes, China's domination of rare earth metals is certainly an interesting one, worth more research, I think. Hello to Absin, and hello to also not a pacifist. China monopolists have zero control over foreign policy. Yeah, I mean, we can do a stream in the future on like why China isn't imperialist and also why Russia isn't imperialist. It's certainly a question. It's continually worth revisiting because this is the bullshit that the Western left comes out with. And yeah, so we might revisit that in the future. George Size says Starmer thinks more about breakfast than anything else. Release the sausages. Yeah, well, he probably got put on a diet by his handlers to stop these enormous girth growing any further. So they probably put him on a diet of like 3 green beans a day. So his mind just went straight to the sausages. Or that, or he was thinking of Ukrainian male models. Who knows? Hello to Bob Parr in Australia. Hello to N. Kenchington. Hello to Zouter as well. And who else we got here? Hello to Bradford. It says accessibility of language is an important factor here. Socialist language can be a huge barrier to workplace discussion. That can be true. It's important to pitch things in the right way. I mean, you can talk to people and lead them in towards socialistic conclusion. You don't need to walk in there and say, fellow proletarians, have you considered that you are being exploited in the following ways for the profit of capital? Allow me to read to you from Capital Volume 1. Now, you wouldn't do that to a group of workers on a picket line, for instance. You need to find a way to essentially lead in for that. And you need to bear in mind constantly what we're trying to do, which is that when we realize that this state, walking up to people and talking like that isn't going to win anybody over, very few people over. Our job is to find the people who have already gone a little way down the road and to bring them in for to enable them to obtain the political education that they need to become communist in our workplace and community. That's where we're at the moment. But when you're looking to do intervention for groups of workers who may well be, shall we say, they might have reached a certain level of class consciousness, but they're certainly not Marxist and certainly don't understand the language and might be alienated by it, then you got to pitch your material in the right way, which gets to the heart of the issue, which doesn't compromise on the conclusions, but expresses things in a way that the worker is going to understand and can relate to their own experience. That's ABCs of politics here. Again, it's important to ask the question, though, constantly: are we diluting the message at all by using certain language? Are we still? Is it the essence of the Marxist-Leninist and understanding and analysis is still there in the text, and we haven't taken it out, and we haven't just collapsed into reformism, that kind of thing? All these are in questions, but yes, you have to pitch things in a way that the worker is going to be able to grasp. There's no point delivering a 200-page academic text to a group of people on a picket line. It doesn't work. That's not going to work. Read the Nazis and monopoly capital, says down with Zionists. Interesting. Certainly the Nazis had an awful lot to do with monopoly capital. They were principally a creation of it. Just writing that down. Okay. Right. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. We have, who's here now, just over 400 of you watching live, which is very, very good. Thanks to all those of you who have tuned in. So moving on. J Galt M4XU. I know that's your old name, but don't be embarrassed. We all come from political traditions which are garbage. Witness my associations with Trotskyism. You say, good point, 95% are stuck on the question, does Israel control the US or vice versa? Dialectics reveals it's not either or. Yeah, it's not as crude as that. It's like it is a case that there is a system there which has existed for a number of years and which each side tries to push in the direction of their interests. It is correct to say, as Hassan Nasrallah did over and over again towards the end of his life, that the imperialists are the ultimate reason why Israel can do what it does. But within that, there is also scope for the Israelis to maximize their advantages with vis-a-vis the relationship with the United States, because their continued survival is so important to the United States. Okay. Yeah, the China imperialism discussion probably needs to happen at some stage. I'll make a note to do that. So hello to Sid and hello to Albert who've just joined us. Edward says, in Latvia, ideology is truly a material force, no matter how bad the material conditions are for the Latvian workers. Well, yes, this is a good point from Edward, which is that materially speaking, like the restoration of capitalism in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia has been an absolute disaster. It's been a terrible, terrible development for the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian workers. But the material force of bourgeois ideology still grips the masses to, at the very least, pacify them or demoralize them to the point where they don't believe any kind of struggle is possible. And that's demoralize workers to the point where they don't believe in their own power as workers or potential power. That is the material expression of the force of bourgeois ideology in that context. So it works for the bourgeoisie as much as it will work for us in the end. Okay, so been going for 2 hours now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw things to a close for today. Be sure me again, or it'll be tomorrow actually, in a slight change of plan. We'll be back again tomorrow because I'm recording Decline and Fall episodes on Friday. So what we'll do is we'll take the show that would have been done on Friday and we'll put that into tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. We're recording a couple of Decline and Fall episodes on Friday, and then we'll be doing the Q&A. I think will be put on Saturday, so I'll be sure to start in advance. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon. We have a special Patreon stream coming up probably tomorrow morning. It's going to be the long-awaited review of Once Upon a Time in the West, so I'll be doing that. And also keep an eye out for the future ongoing reviews of the Scorsese canon as well. Thanks to everybody who also supports the show on Jack and Buy Me a Coffee. None of this would be possible without your assistance. And I will now leave you with your video outro. And please join me tomorrow.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь